Welcome back, folks, to our keynote speaker, the best way to round out the day with an interesting discussion. Because you see, Speed 2 and Independence Day 2 is proof that sequels aren't always better than the first. But we've got Clifford Berg here to prove exactly why Agile 2 is worth using to help organizations improve their DevOps.
Thank you, Darren. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, I hope people can see that. I don't know if these technical issues will ever go away because things keep changing, which is good and bad, you know. But anyway, it doesn't work like in the movies where people just click stuff and everything happens like instantly. So, you know, the interesting thing, Dan Rasky was saying that at SpaceX, which is unquestionably a highly agile organization that builds really complex, huge stuff with thousands of people, and the stuff works, um, and it's cutting edge. So how the heck do they do it? And guess what? They don't use any agile frameworks. They don't use any agile frameworks. Um, it works because of the leadership style and culture that's present within that organization that was cultivated in that company from the beginning. And this is not to celebrate an individual. This is not about Elon Musk or something. There there are leadership styles that were really important that he cultivated there. He and others who he brought in, and that's what this is about. This is not saying, oh, everything they do is great, because it's not. But there's some really important lessons to learn from that. And one is the ability. They're really good at dealing with cross-cutting issues, and they deal with those issues very rapidly. Let's see. And it's because of their behaviors and their culture that they've created there. So agility doesn't result from process, and it's not that process is not important. Process is important. Especially like SpaceX. They're working on the Starship system. And so they're building a lot of things that blow up and so on. But they also build a space capsule that it has to really be reliable and can't blow up with people in it. And so it went through a certification process. So they behave differently depending on how much risk there is. And so there's no process for that. I mean, they make decisions about when they need to be more careful and when they need more process. So the amount of process you have that you need depends. Generally, to be agile, you want the minimum process that you need, but you usually need some process. The question is how much and what does that look like? And agility really arises from making decisions across process. And to make that possible, you need the behaviors, this thing kind of in the middle here, because people need to behave in that way where they reach out. There's SpaceX, there's a huge expectation that if you have a blocker, you don't wait. You don't wait for stand up. You don't wait for PI planning or something. You do something about it right away. You contact who might be affected and you say, we need to talk. And you do your best to drive it to resolution. If you can't, you reach out to someone in a leadership role who can help to get attention of more people and drive that discussion. Everyone's expected to do that, and to support that, there needs to be the culture, because people need to be able to speak their mind and speak honestly. That's actually a huge thing at SpaceX. The one thing you get fired for there is saying you're 100% certain and then it doesn't work. That's what people get fired for at that company. They don't get fired for saying, I think this is not going to work. They don't get fired for that. That's appreciated there. I have a lot of evidence of that. So the absolute honesty about what you actually think is highly valued. That's a cultural value that they have. And people also need the knowledge. They need DevOps and flow patterns so that they have the right mental tools for how to make things work better. So you need all those things. You can't just focus on one of them. And that's why this won't make you agile, or things that look like this. Some big complicated process will not make you agile. It will make you less agile. You'll still get work done, but this actually makes everything more rigid and more inflexible. And these built-in cadences and built-in discussion events and so on discourage people from reaching across and having just-in-time discussions. And this won't make you agile either. It's not that you can't be agile if you're using that, you can. But doing that won't make you agile. Process is the wrong place to start. Process needs to be what you derive. You need to define your own process. It needs to be where you end up for a given moment in time for what you're trying to accomplish. You often need some process. But you don't become agile by starting out with a big quote unquote agile process. That will not make you agile. What about the Agile Manifesto? Well, we saw the Agile Manifesto had a lot of good ideas in it, but it also got misinterpreted and a lot of bad stuff resulted, not through their fault, but because of the way it was interpreted, and the community added a bunch of garbage that wasn't right. So it was too vague, basically. Recently, Jeff Patton, who wrote a book called User Story Mapping, that was really popular, he gave a talk, and I listened to it. I'm glad I listened to the end, because at the very end, he said this is pearl. When people say agile today, they mean something different than they did 20 years ago. It's come to mean something else. And it's really true. And if you look at writing from the early days of agile and what's been written in the last 10 years, they're very different narratives. The stuff that's written more recently is much more intelligent and sensible. Like, one of my favorite books is this Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette. And in there he talks about leadership and how crucially important that is. This book, Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, most people in the DevOps field have read that. There's a whole chapter on leadership in there. So it doesn't have this anti-leader, anti-manager perspective that this early writing had. It's more balanced. A Seat at the Table by Mark Schwartz, who I worked for a while. He talks about, actually he embodied it. He used to skip levels all the time and go around and talk to people and say, what are you doing? What are you working on? And explain that to me. So it's very different than it was. And I'm kind of proud of this. This is David Marquette, who wrote Turn the Ship Around, holding a copy of our book, Agile 2. And this on the right, someone sent me a copy of the books he thinks are most impactful for Agile and DevOps. And our book is among that group that he thought were the most important. And the group that created Agile 2, they weren't just a bunch of random people who had ideas for Agile practices. There are no practices in Agile 2. We specifically recruited a team of people who had these diverse backgrounds. We actually had a table of skills, and we recruited, and the two main criteria besides having these skills were that you had to have a demonstrated independent thought, that you really think for yourself. And number two, you weren't deeply invested in the status quo. So if like Jeff Sutherland had called at me and said, I want to be in that, I would have said, no, you're too invested in the whole Scrum mill. And so Agile 2 is really about behaviors, and it's not simplistic like a lot of the narratives. It's not a bunch of bumper stickers, like self-organizing autonomous teams. There's a good idea in there, but if you do that verbatim, it doesn't work. It's more complicated than that, and Agile 2 is really about transformational leadership and personal agency and learning and knowledge and flow patterns and constructive and generative culture. And, it's informed by leadership theory, operations research, behavioral science, and cognitive science, because those are all at play in this. And, things that old Agile left out, well, product design. The original Agile movement pretty much disconnected real product design from the development flow, which was a disaster. And now people try to throw UX people on teams and try to think that solves it. And guess what? It doesn't. And also data. Data is even more important than code. So why does the Agile Manifesto mention software but not data? Data is so hugely important. How could they leave that out? And so, so that gets to, the knowledge that, you need knowledge of these, practices and how to solve problems, but you also need, and that's what DevOps is, because it's a lot of patterns, like flow patterns and and for doing things, like cattle, not pets, and ideas like that. Build once, deploy many. The DevOps patterns are really patterns for doing things, but it's not enough. It's essential, but not enough. You also need to address behavior, and the behaviors in Agile 2 are about how groups of people and groups of people work together to solve complex problems very rapidly and get good outcomes. you know and you also need the culture, to support those behaviors. So, knowledge and behavior are not enough. You also need the culture. And so we partnered with Human Synergistics, which has a long history. They've worked with over 30,000 organizations, using their culture analysis tools, and they using their tools, which we use. It's possible to actually figure out what kind of culture your organization has, so that you can kind of figure out, well, where are we, and is our culture supportive of the behaviors that we need. And so when you analyze a culture using their tools, you get a chart. This doesn't have any data on the chart; it's empty. But the top four sectors are what they call a constructive culture, and so those have a huge impact on the ability to support the behaviors that you want. And so we actually worked with them um, to map Agile 2's behaviors to their cultural model. And this is one of many charts, and we did a lot of analysis with them. But we were able to identify cultural prerequisites for the Agile 2 behaviors. So, this first one, any initiative requires both a vision or goal and a flexible, steerable outcome. That requires that your culture is achievement and humanistic, encouraging. And, so I'm not going to get into why that is and analyze it right here, but we identified, to have these behaviors, the cultural has to be a certain way, or those behaviors won't stick. And so this is a tiny slice of a very long list. And so we developed a model that includes, behaviors, culture, and knowledge. Just like this thing, but more analytical. We developed, and this is kind of a high level view of that. The real model looks like this, but but anyway, this model lets us think in terms of the impact. Like, if you don't have a healthy culture, then what's the effect of that, and what's ultimately the effect on the right in terms of your ability to make good products and make rapid, effective decisions. And so that whole model, that approach, which we call constructive agility because we named it after this constructive culture, it's not a process or practice framework, and you need it along with DevOps and the behaviors. You need those things all to achieve agility. And so instead of a process for doing Agile, you need a process for defining your own process. You actually need a learning journey where you're applying these ideas and you're improving your culture and doing things to adjust the culture and developing your own processes along the way contextually. And another key thing is to make it all event-based, so your calendars aren't full of recurring meetings. That's how SpaceX operates. People are always looking at outcomes and deciding, do we need to revisit some issue? They don't have retrospectives per se. They're always thinking, how is this going? Maybe we need to change how we're doing. They're always reflecting. And there's a lot of pressure to do that there because it's part of the culture. And in the process of devising your own practices and your own processes, you develop strategies. And they start as just little ideas, but then you build on them and you keep adjusting them. Maybe you even scratch some of them and kind of rethink them. But over time, you're accumulating key strategies with regard to your core business strategy, your product strategy, your technical strategy for those products, your development strategy, how you're building things, your funding strategy, your people strategy, how you're making sure you have the people you need, and enabling, dealing with with all of recruiting, retention, and development and people development, to make sure that you always have what you need and people are doing what they really want to be doing. and your go-to-market strategy, your leadership strategy to make sure you have the right leadership culture, that you're cultivating and promoting the right people and not the wrong people. And so people need training in how to recognize the right people. There's a huge amount of leadership training that's needed for people to be effective. And culture strategy works. And so anyway, you start with the kernel ideas and you flesh these strategies out over time, and they become more robust and more robust. So that's the basic. I finished exactly on time, 70 slides with some interruptions. My wife said it couldn't be done. So, the bottom line is you need all these things. One is not enough. And that's the basis of this talk, because DevOps is usually important. I do a lot of DevOps. Actually, I haven't done any consulting for DevOps in a while, except what we're doing in my company. But I used to do a lot of DevOps coaching and consulting. And you also need the agility promoting behaviors across the organization, and you need the culture to support those. You need all three. And then you have a chance of achieving agility. And process is what you should create. It's not what you should start with. You shouldn't copying someone else's process. It's like copying out, like if your neighbor's family, you like copying how your neighbor handles their family. It probably won't work with your family. It's always contextual. And so you should learn and define your own processes and always be reflecting on them and always adjusting them. Because agility is a learning journey. You create and gradually improve your own processes, and starting with the process is trying to skip the learning and evolving part. And here's some challenge questions. I'm going to go through this quickly so there's time for Q&A. But maybe to reflect on these, and a real list of these would be hundreds of questions, but just like some that pop out. When cross-cutting issues arise, true or false in your organization, when cross-cutting issues arise, they get discussed by the right people and resolved quickly. True or false? Or do you have to wait for some planning event? True or false? Your senior leadership understands DevOps issues and DevOps ideas. Well, why is that important? Well, Jeff Bezos felt he needed to understand whether or not teams were building with APIs. DevOps today is how we build digital products. If you don't understand how your products are being built, you cannot really make good decisions for your business operationally. You have sufficient leadership happening at the integration level, or do you just have a big collection of teams that are kind of like doing their own thing? And real users are involved in conceiving the product, versus a product owner who suddenly magically knows what the product is supposed to be. So it depends on the product. All of these are contextual. There's no right answer to these things. It all always depends. I would love to have any questions or comments.
All right. Well, there you go. There's your signal, folks. Get your questions in now while we've still got Clifford. Some interesting things to think about. I guess one that I want to lead with is how easy do you think it is to implement these changes in larger structures? Because whenever you talk about change, there's a lot of resistance, and you're talking about a system that's been in place for a very long time now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there are kind of two cases. One, you're starting with a new initiative, and two, you're dealing with something that's in place. And, this, it can be an initiative level, or it can be the whole organization level. But regardless, the people at the top need to be the change. Because people get their cues and their signals from their leadership. And when I worked for Mark Schwartz, who was the CIO of the Immigration Service, he really demonstrated that very well. I mentioned he used to skip levels and go around and talk to people. And he also immersed himself in understanding how the work was done. And he set up a process where, for any project to start, the members of that team had to meet him in his conference room and explain how they were going to do the work. Imagine that. The CIO, I think there were a 300 million a year spend organization of this CIO, the IT function there. The CIO would meet with every team and say, how are you going to build this? And half the time he'd say, no, you don't know what you're doing. Go back, talk to Cliff. and come back to me in a week. Because he wanted to know how they're going. He wanted to know that it was going to be a truly agile in their heads. They didn't create a big document. So the people at the top have to be interested in the outcome. And there's some tools we have to often to get them interested. If they're interested enough that there's a problem they want to solve, where we actually can have a conversation with them. We have some assessment tools that will provide very kind of hard evidence. So I mentioned these cultural assessments. We also have an Agile 2 assessment, which is agility promoting behaviors. And then we also have a DevOps assessment, which is based on the Google or the Cole Forsgren's DORA model, but we've tweaked it. We actually think it's better. So by providing evidence, you can sometimes you have a short window of time where people think, huh, and you have their attention. And if you don't grab it then, it's too late. But if you give them evidence, there's a little window of time where you can actually make them realize that what they're doing isn't working, that they need to change, because they need to change usually.
Yeah, I get where you come from, right? It's like you need case studies. It's that put your money where your mouth is type sort of
Yeah.
situation. I guess maybe now seems like as good a time as any in the last several years, right? When you consider the complete change in the way we work due to COVID, also further restrictions with what's going on in Eastern Europe. Like there's a lot of things that are requiring flexibility. And one of your points you made is that Agile one is rigid, it's inflexible, right? So it's kind of make or break, do or die in that way that we should actually now start seeing examples. So I get where you come from. It's a good time for this change.
Well, that's actually interesting, because the Agile Manifesto wasn't rigid. It got interpreted in a rigid way. Like,
Mm,
so there's some things in it that I would have written differently because I actually think they're kind of wrong because they're written a little too absolute. Like, the best form of communication is face to face. Well, no, it's not. It depends. Sometimes it is, but not, it depends. For complex issues, you usually need reading, writing, talking, listening, and thinking. So it's not like, oh, just have everything in a conversation. That doesn't work either for complicated things. Scientific collaboration is huge, and it usually happens through writing. So it depends. If you just want to know, oh, what's the field length, what's the length of field 3 in this JSON object, sure, just talk to someone. But if you want to talk through, like, we have 100 repos, and how are we going to do our branch and merging for this stuff? That's not just a conversation. A lot of people need to write their thoughts down and trade emails about it, and then spend a couple weeks thinking, and then have a meeting, talk it through, do some more writing, and then get together and finally make a decision. It's a complicated process, and a team lead really should be orchestrating that to make sure everyone's getting heard. And that, like, some people aren't saying, oh, I don't read long emails, or I don't have time to meet and talk, or so, someone needs to be watching to make sure the collaboration process is effective. And we need to be neurodiverse. Some people are talkers and some people are writers, and they're both important.
that's a fair way
Um,
of looking at it. And
yeah,
uh,
well,
uh,
one thing I want to add to that, if I could,
sorry,
just one more thing,
yeah.
is, while the Agile Manifesto actually was about balance, extreme programming is kind of the opposite of Agile.
Mm,
Extreme programming is kind of the opposite of the Agile Manifesto because it's about extremes. It dictates a bunch of practices, and so there's really isn't agency there. It's like I have fought off so many insistence that I should be using TDD or I should like pairing, which I don't. And I brought XP into my company, to try it. So it's not like I'm closed-minded against it, but it doesn't work for everybody. And it works great for some people, and but it's this set of extreme practices. But the Agile Manifesto was about balance, which is kind of the
mm,
opposite. We value this and that. We like this more than this, but they're both good. It depends. We value individuals and interactions over process and tools. Well, tools can be important if, guess what, your critical tool, your main tool is down one day. That day, then it's the most important. So, but generally, individuals and interactions are more important. So it depends. It's not an extreme. So XP and Agile are actually kind of opposites in my opinion, which I think is interesting because few people have noticed that.
yeah, it's actually a fair way of looking at it, actually, now that you kind of mention it, right? That whole adage of like you can't have your cake and eat it, right? Like sometimes things are just not compatible. Speaking of like compatibility, I think it's a really interesting question to lead on from something we discussed a little bit earlier, which comes from Frederick. He says, in your opinion, is there any leadership style that works better or worse in the agile environment?
Yeah. Well, an important thing to know about leadership is there isn't one style that is like universal. You need Peter Drucker was famous for saying you need an inside person, an outside person, and a person of action. And with in the Agile tool, we talk a lot about that. The different types of leadership that a group of people and groups of groups need to be successful. And you need lots of different types of leadership in play. And it doesn't mean you have to appoint leaders, although you often do, but it depends. Because emergent leadership can be very good, but sometimes it can be toxic. If we think in the history, some of the emergent leaders in history, like Genghis Khan, not all of them were what would want leading our project. So it depends. And someone in a leadership role, so like this original Scrum paper mentioned the IBM PC project as kind of like this like wonderful scenario. But what's interesting is that the person who set up that team was a highly experienced manager at IBM and handpicked people, and he picked a few key individuals who were known leaders with deep history in different. So there was a manufacturing lead, there was a software lead, and there were a couple others. So he put people on that team who already were known leaders, and it was a hand. And so when you put a team together, you have to be thinking what kind, for what that team's going to be doing, what kinds of leadership is needed, and how is that going to happen? Do I need to appoint people, or do I think it will just emerge there, or should I give it a chance and see what happens? But you can't just step away. You have to set it up and think, is there thought? Because the styles of leadership need to be happening. That's all that matters. There needs to be good thought leadership. There needs to be good inspirational leadership. There needs to be good Socratic leadership to talk things through. Those kinds of leadership need to be happening.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Like, I can see where you come from, right? Like, we've all been in that situation at some point in our career where there's the guy that everyone goes to for answers, and he might not actually even being empowered or motivated by the company. He just knows everything. And I guess to your point, it's important to have someone at the higher level that can identify those people, empower them, and give them those leadership roles to make sure that you're actually getting the best work possible done. So, really cool answer there.
That's a key thing because very often people who don't have leadership training will instinctively like promote people who look like a leader, and they'll empower the wrong people. Very often the people who are like the Agile community embraces servant leadership, which is an important model, but it's not the only model that matters in these situations. There's other kinds of leadership needed too. But a servant leader tends to be someone who's kind of quiet and or maybe not. It depends. A Greenleaf's paper on it is so long and convoluted; it's hard to figure out what he really meant. But very often, someone who's a quiet helper is the best person to empower. But you don't hear about them. If like a leader swoops in and sees the team talking, they see the people who are vocal. They don't see the quiet helper in action. So you need what's called participative leadership, where leaders don't swoop in, but they actually are embedded a little bit here and there. And so they actually get to see what's really going on. That's really important, that they find out what's really going on. Because very often the people who are the best leaders are not the most vocal ones in terms of, the vocal ones, you want them to be the outside person, the person advocating for the team. The ones who are the quiet helpers, you want them to be the inside person. And you also need an organizer and someone who keeps things moving and say, we need to get that figured out because otherwise we're going to have this problem. The organizer, the person of action, the one who keeps things moving and is always thinking about what's falling through the crack. So you need You need individuals, or many individuals who are doing those things, who have those behaviors. Whether they have a title or not doesn't matter necessarily, but sometimes giving them a title empowers them. Because the quiet helper, very often, no one pays attention to them. So if you give them a role, sometimes it empowers them and makes them more effective. But it depends.
I agree. And it's kind of that case of as you turn over employees, new people come to the company, they might not be aware of who those people are. So it can be important to kind of offer those labels, offer those empowerments or new roles so that it kind of sets that in motion, right? Especially when you have new kind of eager coders coming in, maybe juniors, they don't know who to go to. And if they just see a guy that's just, hasn't got a senior rank or isn't in a leadership role, they might not even take their opinion seriously, even if they are actually an expert on the matter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It always depends. Titles sometimes matter, but when you give someone positional authority, giving them a title or giving them a role is giving them positional authority in some way. And it's not necessarily over people. Like someone who's like manager of deployment, maybe has authority over that activity, but not over people. So whenever you give someone any kind of explicit authority, there's a big risk because they can misuse that. Authority is dangerous. So you need to be very careful about who you give these roles to and who you put into a position of this final decision maker. But it's often necessary because otherwise decisions don't get made timely enough. They languish. And so that's why you need to be participative and you need to keep an eye on what's happening, uh, and make sure that people aren't misused. If you do give people authority over certain things, that they're not misusing that. Authority is dangerous, but it's
Oh yeah.
necessary. It's often necessary.
Yeah, it's kind of that whole like notion, when from a political standpoint, like democracy, it's the slowest form of government, but it's also the slowest to fail. But it gets things done, right? It has to keep moving. I guess your point is, it's very easy to just sit and do nothing versus making a potentially wrong choice. But at the end of the day, doing nothing is worse than being wrong, right? You're not even learning from it.
Today it is because in business, time is everything.
Hmm.
You cannot the fastest way to destroy a company is to have decisions languish. You need to and you need to be willing to try things. And developing consensus often is not possible. People have different viewpoints, and you can't really validate one opinion versus another unless you have more evidence. So you need to try it. So if you have a group of people, and again, it's not always about a group. There are groups of groups of groups. If you're building big things, and so someone has to be moving things along. And if you have a group that instinctively, naturally collaborates really well and keeps things moving, then that's all you need. But that's actually an outlier case. Usually you need an individual to be constantly moving things and constantly asking, how is this going? And, oh, that's not going well. Why not? Explain that. We need to talk. Okay, I get it. Let's bring in so and so. Let's talk that through. What do you think we should do? And then, and keep it moving and then realize, okay, we need to try something because we've talked it through. We're not going to learn anymore by talking about it. We need to try something. What does that look like? Is that an experiment? Is that a field trial? How can we move forward on this? That takes the person of action that Peter Drucker used to talk about.
Yeah,
Uh,
it
yeah,
is like linked to the culture, right? Like, not everyone's gonna be fitted for it. As you said, like it's also you can't ever get everyone to agree. It's one of those cases. I think a great example you gave was SpaceX, where it's like if 51% of them say, this could work, then they'll try it, which I think that's one way to go about it. But once again, it's a unique culture thing. Sadly, Clifford, I think we're towards the end of this. I think
sure.
we actually overran a little bit, so we'll probably, I'll probably get badgered a little bit, but I couldn't help it. You're such an informative person. I wanted to get a little bit of extra info out of you, but thank you for this talk. It has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
But folks, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Anything you
I'm
want to
done.
say?
Well, I just
Yeah,
wanted to say thank you. It was a pleasure for me.
definitely. Well, it was a pleasure having Clifford here, but that does bring us to a close. We've enjoyed a lot of discussions here today, and hopefully you discovered a new piece of info here or there. Maybe you just blew your brain up with new knowledge, hopefully. But don't worry, you're going to have to make room in that brain, as there's plenty more to come. Although this is the end of day one, day two will kick off at this same time tomorrow, and you'll have another opportunity to just overload your brain, as we'll have plenty more insightful speakers ahead of us. But just to round this out, once again, thank you to our sponsors, Accenture, TechTree, Rocket Software, and also to all of today's speakers and fellow hosts who have been doing my job on the other tracks as well. And of course, big shout out to our keynote at the end here. He done a phenomenal job of ending this stream. And a big thank you to all of you, because without you, we couldn't do this. But that is going to be it. We all need to go get some food in our belly, get some sleep, and then wake up for tomorrow with a refreshed mind to learn some new things. Thank you for tuning in, guys, and we will hopefully see you tomorrow. See ya.